Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Brannavan tōku ingoa, tēnei te mihi atu ki te mana whenua, taranaki whānui ko Ngāti Toa Rangatira. He mihi nui ki te matapihi, ki te ao nui, ke te mihi Anne, koutou ko Rodney, ko Kirsten, tēnā koutou. Nau mai haere mai ki a koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Hi everyone, my name is Brannavan Gnanalingam, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event. A big thank you to Craig Sisterson, who has organised this event, and for his tireless work. I was going to say indefatigable, but I was going to stuff that up, which I did. But Craig has organised this from the UK in the small hours of the morning, so we're very grateful to Craig for organising this wider series of events. Thank you also to Newtown Library for having us. It's great to be back. And thank you to my panellists, who I will introduce now. So we have Anne in the middle, who has been a music teacher, a bookseller, a freelance editor and reviewer, and school librarian, including to my daughter. Her debut crime novel, The Leaning Man, was released in 2021 through the Cuba Press. Kirsten McDougall's latest two novels, Tess and She's a Killer, were both longlisted for the Ockham NZ Book Awards, and She's a Killer was shortlisted for the Ngaio Marsh Award and longlisted for the Dublin Literary Award. She's a Killer is about to be released in the UK. And Rodney Strong is a Porirua-based author of children's books and cosy mysteries. Since 2016, he has published a scarcely believable 11 books, and I thought I was prolific. His latest is 12 Hours of Murder, which features 12 short stories and features some of Rodney's past characters and a few new ones. And I'm meant to be also participating in the chat, but I'm not very good at talking about myself off like that, so I'll leave it to the others to ask questions about me. But my name is Brannavan Gnanalingam. I've published 7 novels through Lawrence & Gibson, and my latest book, Slow Down Your Hair, came out last year. But the question I always like asking any creative person is the foundation stories as to why they do it. So I'm interested to ask each of you, why do you write? I'll start with you, Rodney, because your story is interesting because you wanted to be a writer, took you a while to get to becoming a writer, and then you've clearly just gone for it.
Yeah. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Yeah, so look, I have always wanted to be a writer. I think from the early age of even being able to write at school, I was writing plays and getting my my classmates to put it on. So it's always sort of been part of my life to want to tell stories and to entertain people, and just sort of drifted away from it and back again. You know, when I was growing up and leaving school, there were sort of limited options. There weren't really the writing courses as such. There wasn't, you know, the only options really were traditional publishing route. So, and back then there wasn't a lot of New Zealand fiction being released, certainly not as much as there is today. So it was always sort of a pipe dream almost. And then, you know, but I still kept writing. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I just thought, well, actually it was my kids' fault that I became a writer because, you know, you tell your kids that they should always follow their dreams, and if you're not doing it yourself, it makes you a bit of a hypocrite. So I thought I better just get on and do it, or give it a go and see what happens. So yeah, it's all that kind of fundamental need to entertain, really.
Similar in that I've written for years, from way back, a lot of tortured teenage poetry. And for a long time I thought I was going to be a poet, but sorry to all the poets. No, and I had a bit of success with publishing, that sort of thing. But I always wanted to kind of get my teeth stuck into something bigger and more involving. And I chose crime partly because it's a very good format to kind of hang a story on. The crime itself is kind of interesting, but that doesn't necessarily always interest me. It's how you write about other things concerning it. That's what interests me. And then you kind of get addicted to it, really, and you think, ooh, I'll do another one. So yeah, but it's partly the entertaining aspect, but it's also just trying to sort things out in my head about how I think about things. Having said that, I'm not any of these characters. I'll just say that for the record. But yeah, so that's me.
I'm interested in good evening, everybody. I'm interested in what you say about, the novel being a place to hang or to focus your mind on ideas. Yeah. Because I think that's probably why I'm really drawn to it as well. And it's a really capacious form. You can bring lots of different ideas, lots of different voices, into one kind of unit, which is what excites me about it. And for this book, this is my third book, and I really wanted to write about kind of climate change and politics and the political time we find ourselves in. I started writing it at the height of Donald Trump's presidency, which was sort of hard to believe now that he was really in charge of that country. And it felt almost hard to believe at that time as well. And how could we even begin to think about immense problems like climate change under the sort of political rule that many countries were coming under. So, and that all sounds very, very serious. And I was really aware of that. So I tried to write a sort of comedy, really, I don't know, maybe it's satire, I'm not too sure. I find it hard to put names to the things that I write or put them into categories, I guess. But I just think the novel's such an incredible form to play in, really. Yeah. What about you, Bran? You've really gone across different genre. Your last book is sort of like is it horror? It's it's definitely thriller. Is it?
I wrote it as a horror. That was definitely my intention. My background is film, so I was always comfortable with the looseness of genre in film, because film had those debates about high art versus genre in the 50s, and they kind of realised that genre can be just as high art as the films which try to be serious. So they kind of got over those debates a long time ago, and that's where I came from. And so Sprigs was a crime novel, sodden downstream with social realism. I write black comedies, horror. I am comfortable jumping between genres because that's, I think, what I was trained to do. But I never wanted to be initially a writer. I wanted to be a filmmaker or a musician. I failed at both, but I wrote a lot about film and music, and then accidentally got published. I wrote I was doing a trip, accidentally wrote a book. My publisher over there might say accidentally getting published might be a different thing. I did a trip from North Africa to West Africa, travelling from Morocco to Ghana, and had such a chaotic trip that I wrote about it and sent it to Murdoch, and Murdoch was keen enough to publish it. So that's how I became a writer. There wasn't any grand plan around it. I did put on plays like Rodney at school, and did have angsty teenage writing like Anne, but I had moved away from that, and then realised that I loved writing and loved the canvas of it, like you, Kirsten. The novel allows me to explore ideas.
I have a question for the young playwrights amongst us, because I used to do that at school as well, write the plays and direct them, and I used to get so grumpy that no one would say the lines properly, or do the things, and I seriously think that's why I become a novelist, because I don't have to, the only people I need to direct are the ones that I'm...
In your head. Yeah. On that...
Yeah, it's on.
On that note, I didn't write the plays. I did the amateur dramatic thing, which is reading somebody else's lines and being somebody else's character. And the thing that I find, particularly writing dialogue, is I don't know if anyone else does this, that I read it out. I read it over and over, read it out loud. And so it's that same sort of dramatic thing and inhabiting characters. I love that you say the novel is capacious. It's the bigness of it, that you can actually have all the different characters and the different voices. And I think also novelists, correct me if I'm wrong, have a little bit of tendency to be control freaks. You can get people to say what you want them to say, which is kind of nice. So the drama thing is, I didn't write them, but I certainly acted in them.
I think it was good training for realising in life that people don't listen to you when you want them to, especially people that are in your class. So it didn't always go well, but I still enjoyed doing it. And I think most of my novels are very dialogue heavy, so I don't think I've ever really gone away from that type of thing. I've just changed the form in which they're written. But it always comes back to some of the writing that I enjoy the most is where two characters are just talking to each other, and what that sort of means and develops in terms of the story. So I think that there's a real blur, sort of what you're saying, there's a real blur in genres and styles of writing, because anytime you include dialogue, it just makes it that much more grey rather than black and white.
Well, I'm interested because in your latest book, you're working, and you frequently work in short stories. That doesn't give you much room from a space perspective, but also from a dialogue perspective. Yeah,
it was a little bit of a probably an experiment. So it came about because I read a book of short stories that a bunch of authors had done on Miss Marple and published last year. And I thought, well, that's because I had always written long form for murder mysteries. So I thought I'd give it a crack. And in some ways it was quite liberating, because you can kind of wrap a story up in 4,000 or 5,000 words. But in others, there's quite a bit of pressure. You can't really, there's not a lot of fat in short stories. Every word in particular in short stories has to earn its place. So it was some of the stories were more challenging than others. Yeah.
I mean, you've obviously jumped between the two, Kirsten, between short stories and novels, and how...
Yeah, well, just hearing you say 3,000 to 4,000 words, I've been trying to write a short story, what I thought was a short story, but it's up to like 6,500 words now, and I'm like, I can't see an end. Yeah. And I think I'm finding it harder and harder to write short stories. And it could be because I'd sort of trained my brain a bit longer now. I used to be able to write quite tight pieces, and I just, there's something in me doesn't want to anymore. I wish I could, but I love the form. I absolutely love the form, It's interesting too, I teach, for 3 years I've taught a class called long form story, it's a creative writing class up at the IIML at the uni, and the students have to write a 10,000 word story. And which is a sort of arbitrary length, but what's really good about it is it forces them to actually finish a story, and they have to deal with the same characters, they have to have some sort of character movement or arc, or they have to have some stuff happen. Because I think what happens when they do the short fiction courses is they get stuck and they go, oh, I'll just finish here and I'll move on to the next one. So it's quite a good little training ground. But I think I would struggle in one of those short fiction classes myself these days.
Yeah, I absolutely don't have the rigour for short writing. I can't do poetry or short stories. It's not something I have ever been able to do. And all of your books place features really strongly. And Anne, yours is very recognisably Wellington. And why Wellington, and what about the city made you think that it would be a perfect setting for a pretty dark crime novel?
I'm not from Wellington. I'm from Christchurch originally, and although I have lived here for almost 30 years, so I think I can call myself a Wellingtonian now, but I'm still fascinated by it because it is so completely different from Christchurch, even before the earthquakes, nothing to do with the earthquakes. Wellington it's a harbour city, it's darker with the hills. I remember when I first moved here, and somebody would, they'd invite you over and they'd give you these detailed instructions on how to get to their place. Don't park, don't come up the street. You have to go along the road, park there, and then you come up, and then we're 30,000 steps up the side of the hill. And I'd be like, what? Don't you just drive up and park on the, So Wellington as a landscape has always fascinated me, and a working port is the other thing which I've found really interesting. When I first moved here, the wharves were just dodgy as. You didn't go down Blair or Allen Street. I mean, and just seeing that change in the city. And also it's kind of now what I know. So, and I like the idea of doing that. I mean, you get a lot of writers, like this Scandi noir writers and all the Scottish writers, and you learn about their city. And even if you haven't been to Edinburgh, you learn about the city. They write like they know it. And I thought, I'm going to do that. And so, yeah, that was the decision. But on the other side of that coin is you have to get it right, or somebody will come and tell you that you've got it wrong. And that was slightly terrifying. But it was fun. It was actually, I think you can do a walking tour if you want around the streets that I mentioned. But anyway, that was me.
I mean, I had that with Sodden Downstream, where I had the character walk from Lower Hutt to Wellington, and I timed it along with in terms of my walking, and then someone said, no, that's too short. They must have done it themselves drunkenly or something, but I stand by my timing. But meanwhile, Kirsten, you also... I was also drinking too. You've also set your book, Kirsten, in Wellington, but you imagined it in a future kind of way, so it's still very recognisably Wellington, but you also had to imagine a kind of future Wellington. Was that fun to do?
Yeah, I mean, I call the Wellington in the book shit Wellington, and you can see bits of it anyway. Like one of my favourite places is that Amora. Is it the Amora Hotel? Like the Wellington in the book is like that with little bits of really wealthy established shops, like a Louis Vuitton next to a sort of Amora Hotel. That's how in my head I saw it. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, writing scene, like describing how a place looks, is one of my least favourite parts of writing. So I tend to go as lightly as possible, because I always think, play to your strengths. If you're not enjoying it, the audience probably isn't going to enjoy it that much either. But the house in the book is set in a house that I lived in at the top of Rolleston Street when I was young, and it's sort of, falling apart, and there's a scene at Toi Whakaari, and so for me it was, quite alive, and the book ends up in the Wairarapa, which is a place where I grew up as well. But I had a work colleague say to me back in February, I read your book over Christmas. It was just, it really reminded me of my youth growing up in Grey Lynn. When did you live there? And I was like, I was set in Wellington. So the reader really brings their imagination to the work, right? Yeah. And I thought that was great. I was like, oh, that's cool, if that's what you see, that's fine.
Meanwhile, Rodney, your books are kind of set everywhere. Does it allow you to travel? Is it a kind of mental travel route for you?
Well, it's a double-edged sword, really, because you're still writing about places that are real. So they're either set in England, and one of my series was set on the coast of France. So you've got to kind of work out how long by boat it'll take you to go from this port to this port, because someone surely will pick up and go, no, it takes twice as long as that. So there are things like that. I mean, my main series that I write is set in Wellington, but it's in a fictional retirement village, so it's very insular. Wellington's almost a background character, but the great thing is the main character is in her late 90s, so you get to explore the history of Wellington as well. So there's flashbacks to 1930s, and when the train station was opening, and when the Wellington Free Ambulance building on the wharf was first being built. So you kind of get that side of things as well, rather than just the kind of modern Wellington. But there's enough there that people still will come up and go, oh, look, it was really good to read about places that we see. So it's probably less of a pronounced character than some of the others, but it's kind of still there in the background.
Well, should we have a bit of a reading? We'll intersperse the whole chat with some reading. So do you want to kick that off, Rodney?
Okay. You never know. So this is the first story from 12 Hours of Murder. So this features Alice, who's a 98-year-old retired con artist, whose motto is be the smartest in the room, and if you can't, then be the most cunning. So this is entitled 9am Knew His Killer. Henry Nelson knew his killer, of course. Alice enjoyed the way her friends were looking at her, although she thought they shouldn't have appeared so astonished. It wasn't the most outrageous thing she said in her 99 years, or even in the last week. Knew him how? Asked Frida, one of her inner circle at the Silver Moon retirement village. Of course he knew him. He'd made the appointment, 9am on the dot, although the man was notorious for being late. If only he'd been late that day, things might have been quite different. Owen sat back in his chair and sighed. I know what you're trying to do, Alice, and it won't work. He discarded 2 cards and picked up the replacements dealt to him by the 4th person at the table, Les. Yes, Les agreed. You're trying to distract us so you can win again. Alice regarded them all with a smile that said she didn't need to distract anyone to win at poker. Unfortunately, it's working, admitted Frida. What do you mean he made the appointment? They were sitting in the games room and were alone for the time being, although Alice could hear the whirring of the treadmill in the small gym next door. Well, it's... Les held up his hand to stop her. You're doing what Frida accuses me of. You're starting in the middle of the story. I do not accuse you of that at all. If anything, the thing you're guilty of is exaggerating all the time. If the two of you could pause the argument for a moment, Owen said, I'd really like to hear Alice's story. Les muttered something under his breath, but they both lapsed into silence, and the trio looked expectantly at Alice. Thank you, Owen, and you're quite right, Les. I was starting. If not halfway, at least not at the beginning. Henry Nelson was a harmless enough man, but unfortunately for him, he knew something worth killing for. Alice chuckled. All right, I'll behave. Henry Nelson was the last person you'd expect to be targeted for murder. He was a fireman in the small town of Maddingville in England. I believe they're called firefighters now, Alice, Frida said. They're a woman as well. That may now be the case, replied Alice, but this was in the 60s and he was a man, so I'm calling him a fireman. Frida held up her hand in mock surrender, and Alice continued with her story. Like all small towns, Henry knew everyone, at least well enough to chat to in the street, and everyone knew him. When there was a fire, half the time they'd bang on his front door rather than ring the fire station. So he was popular, asked Owen. Alice shook her head. Popular isn't the right word. He kept to himself when he wasn't rescuing kittens from trees or dousing flames. Do firefighters actually do that? I thought that was just in the pictures, Frida said. And not only kittens, he'd been known to deliver a calf now and then if the vet was occupied elsewhere. Are you making this up? Les asked with a suspicious look. Alice continued as if he had not spoken. One day, there was a big fire.
We might intersperse the reading, so but I do have a question for you, Anne. Returning to something that you'd said about Wellington being this kind of dark and the kind of hills, the high-low aspect is quite pronounced in your book. You've got key scenes set in Mount Victoria, and disparity from a metaphorical point of view. You've got a key character who's homeless, and you've got some pretty well-off characters, and I'm kind of interested in the way you write about disparity in a crime novel.
Oh. I hadn't actually thought of it like that, but I guess that is the case. I don't think I deliberately had characters who were, that I thought, oh, they're wealthy, they're not. I was more interested in specifically the not wealthy, I guess. And I was also interested in how we perceive people, how we see people on the street, and we make our minds up about them immediately. And in fact, they have another life that we don't know about, that we haven't seen. And I think that's really where I was going with that. But I've also got the high-low with the dentist scene, because she's, anyway, that's another high-low thing. Yeah, the whole wealth thing, it is something that interests me, the social differences with people, absolutely, yeah. But I don't know if that was deliberate or not. That's a really hard one, sorry.
No, sometimes these things just happen as writers, or people bring their own kind of interpretations to it. But obviously with Kirsten, in your book, you had you were writing, as you said at the start, about in the era of Trump, and you were wanting to talk about climate change, and it's clearly a key aspect of the book with the refugees and the people who were coming to New Zealand, the Peter Thiel type figures with their bunkers. What was some of the kind of ideas that was underpinning the formation of the book for you?
Yeah, well, I think if we're talking about social class or, socioeconomic class, one of the things that's really emerged in the last 50 years is this continual squashing of the middle class. We're at the point today where even people on decent wages are finding it difficult to shop at the supermarket, So I guess I am interested in what that kind of accumulation of capital that a very few manage to do means for the rest of us, and what that means if other countries become uninhabitable, and how we choose to help each other or not. And I suppose the book is not that favourable towards the way we might make decisions to help our fellow humans. I'm really interested in class. I think that it impacts everything, and I think that's something I'll continue to write about. I mean, it's something you've written a lot about.
Yeah, it's an obsession of mine in terms of my writing. I have always, right from my first book, class has been kind of a key factor in terms of what I am interested in trying to explore about the world, and for me how it intersects with a whole bunch of other factors which might define a person. But I mean, my heroes starting to write were writers like Balzac and the 19th century novelists, who class was such a foundational part of why they were writing, and for me that was exactly the same. And I have always kind of viewed my books as sitting with each other, so I might write about kind of upper class teenagers, but I also want to write my next book about people who are much more struggling or down their luck. They all sit in the same world, and for me that is the key reason why I write and kind of link the books in the way that I do.
Yeah, and thank goodness, because I think that for a long time we've had this idea in New Zealand like that we're so egalitarian. I don't know if we have that idea anymore, but it's kind of a class as a conversation I always want to talk about.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I mean, this is something that I've talked about with other writers, is that when we write about class, it often doesn't get picked up in reviews either. It doesn't really become a thing that people focus on or think.
Yeah, and I think that's that hangover of us sort of being set up as this sort of egalitarian society, which is utter crap. I mean, it was a colonised country, and we imported ideas from the north into this country, and I
think every country though has got an idea of itself. I mean, the whole Italian, love life, whatever sort of thing, and the French being terribly fashionable. I mean, it's not a social thing, I guess, but the whole egalitarian New Zealand thing, I mean, that's been forever, but it never, I mean, it existed to a certain extent, but it went a long time ago, didn't it?
Yeah, but I think there's a hangover in like what Brannavan's saying, is that it often doesn't come up in our conversations. In the same way, if I've got family who live in the UK, it is in the conversation there, because it's so obvious. It gets split up into suburbs and things. And I mean, the thing is, in Wellington, we split ourselves up by different class. I mean, I live in Orfeto Bay, which is next to Island Bay, which is a very wealthy suburb, and it looks nothing like Porirua or Cannons Creek, So, that exists here. I just don't think we talk about it in such a direct way that gets talked about in England, maybe. Yeah, I don't know.
well, I'm interested in the form and the way we kind of use form to express some, to work through some of the ideas. And you've written a pretty grim crime novel. No, it's great fun, but it's also quite grim subject matter. And I'm interested in the way you've used the genre of crime in order to tell the story, and kind of, even if the political points weren't necessarily front of mind when you were writing it, they do come through in that form of narrative.
I was interested in, without giving too much away, I was interested in the idea of exploitation, and the idea that that doesn't happen in this country. And then, I was reading article after article about workers being brought into the country and having passports taken off them or not being paid properly, all these sorts of things. And you think, yeah, it does happen here. And I was also reading a lot of articles about human trafficking and why people do it, why people choose to be trafficked, I guess, or not, or the whole, immigration thing, or not being allowed into countries. And I thought, oh, we're not that far away from that. We're close enough to that, and I reckon that obviously it does happen here, but that was my sort of fundamental theme that I was interested in, was does it happen here, and how would I write a story about it? And the crime was, as I say, the genre to hang that discussion on. It's awful not saying too much about what goes on and not giving it away, but yeah.
Well, should we have a bit of a reading?
Right. These are kind of new. I'm still getting used to them. Otherwise, I can't see what I'm doing. Here we go. Okay, so this is the first chapter. I have a character whose nickname is Mad Dog, and he is homeless, and he lives up on Mount Vic, and many years ago, or my husband still does, he does a lot of orienteering around the place, and I remember years and years ago he told me he was orienteering around the hills somewhere around Mount Vic, and he said, I came across a camp, and I was like, what do you mean a camp? And he'd come across somebody's home, and he said, it happens quite a lot. He'd be out running around the hills and come across various sort of encampments. I remember thinking, I'll tuck that away, that sounds interesting. So this is Mad Dog. He's got a camp up on Mount Vic. And he needs cardboard. A shimmer caught his eye. He's gone to a skip where he knows he can find cardboard to keep him warm at night, and the skip is on Tory Street, or off Tory Street. A shimmer caught his eye, part way up one of the buildings that backed onto the alley, the outline of a woman, an angel really. He counted 4 stories up. Her dress was white and floated just a little. Her hair was long and loose and golden. Flicking it away from her face, she turned with her back against the glass sheets of the balcony. Even at this distance, he could see she was pretty, so pretty. Even if she didn't have wings, Mad Dog sat in the skip and stared up at the balcony, up at the angel. Behind the tip of another building, he caught sight of the moon, an almost perfect full sphere. Tomorrow it would reach its peak. He looked back at the angel, the moon and the angel, perfect. She seemed to be talking to someone. Her arms were moving in time with the conversation. Mad Dog began to hum some long-forgotten music in time with the angel's arms. He saw the other figure, just briefly, more of an outline, really. Mad Dog smiled. He was glad she wasn't alone. Someone as beautiful as that shouldn't be alone. The air was cooler now. The breeze had picked up. How come she wasn't cold? She should have been cold. If Mad Dog had been with her, he would have draped something around her shoulders. The thought made him frown. He put his head down and busied himself with the cardboard and the rope. After a few minutes, he permitted himself another glance up at the balcony. Her arm moved over her head with another graceful ballet movement, like she was drawing a large circle in the air. Then turning and leaning slightly forward towards the street, her hand let loose a star, a shooting star. The pretty angel woman with the floating dress and the golden hair dropped a shooting star. With a small crack, it bounced off the side of the skip and into the rubbish. Well, if some angel woman was going to send him a shooting star, the least he could do was pick it up. Mad Dog reached forward to find it. Then came the scream. Angels don't scream, he thought, but that's what he heard. A scream and a flapping and arms and hair and a noise he never wanted to hear again. He had heard many things in his life. Grown men cry, the silence of a baby, the inner workings of his own softly scrambled brain. The sound of a body hitting the ground was something else. Mad Dog sat there on his pile of cardboard staring at the star the angel had thrown him. He twisted around and peered over the side of the skip. She didn't move. No one came running. He stared up at the building she'd come from and watched the shadow push something up against the balcony, then retreat away from the edge. He knew there would be police. Mad Dog was okay with the police, and the police were okay with him, but he didn't want to be there when they arrived. He grabbed his bag, he pocketed the fallen star and pulled himself up out of the skip. The cardboard could wait. He could always go to the shelter if the weather got bad. Keeping to the shadows of the alley and with the faint sound of a siren curling its way into his head, Mad Dog scurried into the night.
And Rodney, I mean, I'm interested in the way that you use crime, and I use a quote that that your fictional writer Barbara Graves says. The problem is I can't stop murdering people. Is it fun?
Well, it's always fun murdering people, but I think I often joke about if people looked at my search history on Google, there'd be some interesting things. The latest is about how do you turn arsenic into gas. Anyway, I mean, it sort of comes back a little bit to what Ian was saying before around the murder's almost secondary. It's with cozy mysteries, there is like most genres, there's certain kind of rules around it. So there's no graphic description of murder, so it is almost like you found the body, they're dead, and then the story really becomes about how do you solve that murder, which I find more interesting anyway. And when I grew up with all of that, watching Murder, She Wrote, which was like that sort of thing where it's TV, so it was 80s, 90s, very sanitised version of what murder actually is, but it was all about the cleverness of the person trying to solve the murder, and I think that's far more interesting for me and far more interesting for people to read sometimes as well. So yeah.
Was that something you knew right from the outset when you wanted to write crime, that was the type of crime that you wanted to do?
Well, I'd never heard of the term cozy mystery until I wrote my first one, and then it was just a murder mystery to me. And then someone said, and then when you write books, you have to do this silly thing called market them. And so you've got to work out who to market it to. So that's when the kind of cozy mystery thing came in. And there's lots of, I made a few mistakes with that first. Cozy mystery readers are usually very avid and adamant about following those rules. So I got told off by a few readers in that first one for saying some words. I used the word penis, which apparently is a big no-no. Just from reviews. And the first cozy mystery I had a supernatural paranormal element to it, where the main character has spirits who sort of ride around in his head, and they're called hitchhikers. And apparently that's not what ghosts do, according to one reviewer. So apparently I've broken all sorts of paranormal conventions as well. But yeah, look, I think there's a real art to what my fellow authors do in terms of that kind of grittiness. But me, when I do any sort of writing, it tends to lean a little bit more to the light-hearted, humorous side anyway. So it kind of just drifted into that way rather than sort of trying to write the gritty kind of hard-boiled stuff.
Have you found yourself leaning more and more into these kind of expectations for cozy crime?
Yeah, and I think, series is always more fun anyway, I think, because you can, each subsequent book, you don't have to set the world up again, it's already there, and the characters are more developed, so they just kind of develop more and more each story, and it just lends itself to keep going that way, so yeah.
With She's a Killer, that's quite hard to define from a genre perspective. It's kind of sci-fi, there's crime, there's thriller, there's social realism. It seems like the ideas kind of led the narrative rather than necessarily working within a kind of genre framework. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I do think that I adhere to the sort of story structure that we often want in a novel. You know, we want the inciting incident, we want the crisis, we want the climax, and we want some resolution. So, you know, but yeah, I don't. I just kind of write what comes out, you know, and I think that makes it tricky sometimes for the publishers, you know, for people to sort of go, well, what even is this, Kirsten, you know? Yeah.
But I mean, I guess also this is a broader canvas than what you previously worked on. So you maybe had more time just to kind of stretch with those frameworks.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like one of the kind of non-realist aspect of this book is the narrator has an imaginary friend, and in my previous books I've had a sort of ghost mother following a character around, and then also the protagonist in my second book could sort of see people's, she could sort of visualise what people were, like if they had strong emotion, like she could kind of visualise their stories. So I'm really interested, I think, in kind of aspects of human psychology, you know, like ghosts, or you know what they are to us, or what an imaginary friend is. And the other thing I found was in writing this was that an imaginary friend is a really useful foil, particularly for a first-person narrator, because you know when you're writing in first person, you can only go where the character's going, and so the imaginary friend could actually help make jokes, because the main character is the only person who can see the imaginary friend in the room, but also the imaginary friend could give the audience information that the main character wouldn't necessarily want to. So yeah, so it was sort of a useful device in a way, whilst also kind of giving quite a lot of information about the main character's psychic state. Yeah, because what kind of 37-year-old has an imaginary friend?
Did you have Alice?
A lucky one.
Did you have Alice's voice in your head before you started writing?
From the get-go, yeah. So the first scene that I wrote, it didn't make it into the book, but it was a very strong, comedic voice. It was a scene with her mother, and yeah, and Simp was there as well, the imaginary friend. So yeah, it was very voice-driven. I think everything I write is voice-driven. Yeah.
Well, should we have a listen to Alice's
Yeah, sure.
voice?
So this is just this beginning of chapter 2. Alice, the narrator, works at university, or a sort of falling down version of the university, maybe what the university will look like next year. Okay. Once I got through university security, I was 20 minutes late, and there was a mature student already waiting by my cubicle. You only had to be 25 to be considered a mature student. Lots of people complained about it, how it made them sound elderly when they were mid-20s. This guy looked like he was in his 30s. He looked like he had money, and he also looked grumpy. I hung my jacket on the back of the chair and sat down. You're late, he said, pointing at the opening hours notice on the wall. Hello, I said. Enrolments? Eh? Are you or are you not enrolments? He spoke in a matter-of-fact way and had an English-sounding accent, though he looked Asian. Definitely a wealth-ugee. We'd been primed to watch for them. They were worth a lot of money to the university. It was core policy to be very welcoming to them. Sure, I said, putting a big smile on my face. I've come to make a formal complaint, he said. Oh, I said, you should probably see Gerald for that. He's my manager. He deals with all the complaints. He's trained in helping people with their complaints. No, it's okay, said the guy. I can talk to you. I tried hard to smile. You'll need to record this because it's formal, he said. I grabbed a piece of paper and wrote the date at the top, then wrote formal complaint and underlined it. I looked up at him. Okay, I'm ready, I said. Don't you use a system? I held up my pen. This is a system, I said. Computer's not ready yet. I tapped a few keys on my computer to show I was making an effort. The guy shook his head like he didn't believe me, even though it was true. I hadn't had time to turn my computer on. Okay, he wriggled his finger in the air as he spoke. I want to know why there is no Russian literature department in this university. That wasn't the sort of complaint I'd been expecting. Generally, people came here to complain about the number of forms we made them fill out. There hadn't been a Russian literature department in the university since the 90s. I told the guy this. I know, he said, it's completely unacceptable. Maybe, I said, but I don't know if you can retroactively lay a complaint about something that stopped happening nearly 30 years ago. I mean, isn't that like complaining to Germany about World War II? They're just going to nod their heads and say, we know, it's such a shame. I wasn't, strictly speaking, giving my best customer service, but I was feeling distracted by the sauerkraut incident. I'd done it because Sim was there and she was pissing me off. I'd done it to prove I still had my edge. It's nothing like that, the guy said. That is a specious argument. I wrote no Russian literature and specious argument down on my piece of paper so he knew I was taking him seriously. I looked at him and nodded. I tried to look like I was making an effort. We were supposed to take all inquiries very seriously, most especially wealth-ug inquiries. It was part of cascading educational dreams into reality, inquiries into fee-paying students. He tapped his finger on my desk. Though maybe you have a point, this is an ethical issue. I'm asking that a university actually act like an institution of higher learning and allow its students to study different world literatures. In fact, your government should mandate that the literatures of the world be taught in its universities. I don't know if our government can mandate. The guy interrupted me and continued his rant, especially now you've got people from all over the world living here who don't just want to study English novels, we want to read big novels, ones with ideas, world-saving novels. I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to ask some questions, so feel free to start thinking about them. I'll ask a couple more before we get to that. Rodney, what makes a character, in hindsight, make you want to revisit them? So that you have recurring characters and your recurring settings. Do you know at the time that actually I want to write about them in another story, or is it afterwards that you go, actually no, this person's cool?
A little bit of both. I think we've all read stories where you get to the end and go, oh geez, I wish I knew what happened with this character next. So there's a real there's a real desire to kind of expand on that. But the main character from my main series first appeared as a bit character in one of my other books, so she was only there for a couple of pages, but was really fun to write in those 2 pages. So when I was looking for ideas, I thought, well, I'll expand her, and then the feedback about her is just so fantastic from readers that they just wanted more. And the more I explored her, because she is so old, she's had such a life, there's such a sort of deep well of information to explore that it made me want to write more and find out more about her as I was going as well. So yeah.
Great. And Stella's such a memorable character. Could you see yourself revisiting Stella?
By the time this was published, I didn't like her and I didn't want anything more to do with her ever again. And I'm serious, I thought, I can't, that's it, it's done. And it was quite a few months later, and I remember thinking, maybe I'm not quite finished. And I got a draft of another one, but I think this will be the end. I'm really sick of her now. But after I'd had enough time when this one came out, I remember thinking, I think there's unfinished business, and I thought, I think I have to try and figure out what she's going to do, like you were saying, and that's whether it's published or not, I don't know, but I definitely have got her out of my system now, I think, so yeah.
And Kirsten, you've had to revisit Alice with the English edition that's coming out soon, or British edition that's coming out soon. How have you found that process of adapting quite a New Zealand character into that British context?
Yeah, I mean they've been really good. They didn't want any major changes, which was great. We have quibbled over some of the language. They couldn't handle me saying the kitchen bench top. That was far too confusing if you're English, so it's now a countertop, that's fine. One of the big discussions we had was around the use of Māori words, and they made the suggestion that I might like to translate them, and I made the suggestion that would be received as a form of colonisation in this country, and seeing as I lived in this country, I wasn't going to do it. So we, and I feel quite strongly about that, because I read literatures from all over the world, and I'm really happy to actually learn new words, and I'll also happily read sentences that are in a language I don't understand, and I just sort of go, well, you know, yeah. So I've glossed words, and it was really interesting also to think about, like, I mean, there's not that many Māori words in it, but there are words like tangi, marae, iwi, te tiriti. There's a few other. And I said, the thing is, I can't translate tangi as a funeral. I mean, it's an event that's held on the death of a person, but it is not a funeral. And yeah, and because partly, you know, in this book, the refugees are sort of seen as another kind of wave of colonisation. I just, it was important that remains intact. And they were cool about it in the end, yeah. But it's interesting to think of it as going into a space where that is even a question, you know what I mean? Like, it's not a question here anymore. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that goes down. Yeah.
We'll open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask? And do we need to run the mic around?
Everyone's hungry.
We do have some kai for the end, so just heads up on that one.
Well, I can also ask a generic, what's next for everyone? Start with you, Rodney. What's next for you?
So I'm working on a new book with a new character, about a third of the way through first draft for that. So it is set in Wellington, so Wellington plays much more of a key role in this book. Still murder mystery. I haven't quite decided whether it's going to be cosy or not. Every now and then when you write cozies, you just want to throw a swear word in. So there might be occasional swear word that takes it out of there and a little bit more into standard kind of crime. But yeah, I'm enjoying exploring that and see how it goes.
As I said, I've got a draft of another one of these finished, and I'm looking at, because I can, the theme of conversion therapy, which has obviously been in the news recently, and mega churches. Yay! It's a great combination, and so we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah, I mapped out a novel on Monday morning. Yeah, it was crazy. I got some of those. Oh no, it was sort of between breakfast and lunch. I got some of those stick-it notes, you know, because I've seen like novelists do this, and I was like, I'm going to give that a go. Yeah, it was quite cool. Yeah, so but I've got a really full-on job at the moment, so which I'm absolutely loving. So I do approach writing like I need to build up a head of steam and has to feel like it absolutely needs to be written. Yeah, and in the meantime, just writing kind of picking away at short stories that I can never keep that short. But it's important to me to keep my hand in. You know, I really do think it's an exercise, and you learn something, and you've got to make lots of mistakes. You know, like I really learn through failure. You know, I really believe in failing better every time. You know, yeah. What about you? You're always got stuff on the go.
I was meant to start a bit earlier than I had planned, but I managed to concuss myself for the third time in 3 years. So I took a little bit of a break, but I'm now ready to write. I'm writing a sequel to Sodden Downstream, which is set 6 or 7 years after those events. So a kind of family saga, effectively, is kind of what it's going to end up being.
What's it like going back to characters
It's
after a break, you know?
It's fun, actually. So very similar to, I guess, with what Rodney said, there's that kind of weird imperative where you have these characters who you're like, actually, I want to know what happens. And I remember someone reviewing Sodden Downstream and saying this is actually a book and he'd read quite a lot of my other books where he'd said that this is the first one of my books that he'd read that he wanted to know what happened to them, and he hoped that they were okay, essentially, after Sodden Downstream, which is a pretty grueling book from a class perspective. So this is going to be similarly grueling, but it's about the father and son in the book rather than necessarily see to the mother. It's about tradies and I guess the kind of dirtbag left kind of idea of people coming together from a solidarity perspective, but not necessarily realising that that's what they're doing. So that's the plan.
And you said it when we started that your background in film. Have you gone back and thought about trying to turn? Because it seems to me like so many of your novels would actually make fantastic films. Have you thought about giving it a go yourself?
I've never actively thought about it. I think something you'd said about the plays being like, hating that people wouldn't do what you said. I mean, the main reason why I knew I wasn't ever going to be a filmmaker is I'm terrible with admin. And there is no way that I would have the...
You get a producer, Brad.
the organisational skills to do it. But yes, I could get a producer, but I'm just not very... That coordination is not necessarily something that I am attracted to now. I think I've come to realise I really enjoy just me and the page and writing. I mean, I'd love to have my books adapted for film. I write with film in mind, but I'm also kind of happy for someone else to take that on and to do that, because I also like the idea of other people interpreting my work. I mean, I've just found out, hopefully, that someone is adapting A Briefcase, Two Pies at a Penthouse for the stage, so that will be quite exciting to see how he goes about it. But yeah, I'm happy to leave other people to do that rather than do it myself. Anyone have any questions now that we've had a little bit more time to think? Otherwise, we can call it here, and there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards if you would like to hit us up individually. And obviously it sounds like there's some food around. But thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you to my panellists for this lovely wide-ranging conversation, and I hope you all have a good evening. Thank you.